Okay, hey everybody. Here we go. This is another actual live recording from 2019. I've been kind of slack about updating the videos, but I kind of figured the ones I made last year seem to be working okay. So anyway, this year. So in this chapter, chapter 11, we're going to talk about monopoly. So you might remember from the previous chapter, we were studying perfect competition. There were some great questions on the discussion board about what makes a market competitive. Now we're looking at sort of the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where a market is not competitive at all. It's a pure monopoly. Um, you probably have a pretty good idea what monopoly is, other than the board game. A monopoly is a market in which there's only one seller of a good or service with no close substitutes. Some good examples are there, things like the U.S. Postal Service, Bangor Hydro or Emera, Walmart, McDonald's, things like that. All people have all claimed to be monopolies. The first thing I want you to understand is that it's really not that simple. Monopoly is not just black and white. Um, the U.S. Postal Service is probably pretty close. If you want to stick a letter out on your mailbox and have somebody carry it away and deliver it somewhere else, U.S. Postal Service is pretty close to your only option. But in this day and age, if you simply want to get a message or a small package to somewhere else, you got lots of other options. You can send them an email or a text. You can use UPS or FedEx. So is U.S. Postal Service a monopoly? I don't know. It kind of depends on how you define the market. Bangor Hydro, Emera, that's pretty close. You know, if I want traditional electric utility service in my house, Emera is my only option. But if I just want lights on, you know, I can have a generator, I can have solar panels and batteries and things like that. I can just burn candles. You know, there are other substitutes for Emera's product or service, but granted, they're not very good ones. So I would say Emera is really very close to a monopoly. People have claimed Walmart's a monopoly. You'd probably think McDonald's is not, and I would say, you know, in most senses, McDonald's is not a monopoly because there are lots of other fast food restaurants or just restaurants in general. But again, it depends on how you define the market. If you really want a Big Mac, McDonald's is your only option. So in that sense, it could be considered a monopoly. So that's one of the things to keep in mind is it's not always as simple as we think to decide what is and what is not a monopoly. So a more relevant concept, what economists really talk about more than pure monopoly, is just monopoly power. Uh, Businesses may or may not have monopoly power, and this is something that occurs in degrees. So monopoly power is also called market power. Basically, it just means the ability of the business to act as a price setter. Like, to what extent can a business play around with its prices and raise them and lower them? Um, that's really what market power or monopoly power is all about. So Emera has lots of monopoly power. You know, like I said, there are substitutes for Emera, but they're really not very good ones. They aren't realistic for most people. So realistically, no matter what Emera charges me, I'm going to keep the power coming to my house. McDonald's, I'd say, has relatively little, although there's some brand name loyalty. Some people really love McDonald's. Maybe they really love Big Macs or they love McDonald's fries, but they have relatively little. At the other end of the spectrum, I would say, you know, something close to perfect competition would be like commercial fishermen. A lobsterman coming off the boat in Maine brings home a load of lobster, and they're going to sell them to some wholesaler. That wholesaler tells them what the price is for the day. The going market price is set by the market. The lobsterman has zero ability to affect that. So that's an example that's pretty close to perfect competition. So that's the way we really think about monopoly, is more in kind of degrees of market power rather than like a black and white concept. Okay, one of the tricky parts, critical thinking number 4, if you choose to write that one. Remember, you just have to write 2 of the 4. Critical thinking 4, if you choose to write it, asks you to look up an antitrust case where the government sued or was asked to break up a monopoly. And one of the things that you have to figure out in there, and this is sort of one of the trickier parts of that paper, is what's the barrier to entry? So, as the book explains it, in order for a monopoly to exist and remain in place, there must be some barrier preventing other companies from coming in and competing with it. right? I mean, if Emera is making a lot of money selling electricity, it would make sense for some other company to come in and say, hey, well, we can sell electricity too, maybe cheaper than Emera. But there's a barrier to entry there. So what's the barrier? Here's the list of possible ones. At the top is economies of scale. I would say if you're not sure what the barrier is, go with this one. It's probably economies of scale. If there's nothing else that's obvious, this one makes a lot of sense. Economies of scale just means that a business's larger size allows it to operate with lower average costs. So, as a business gets bigger and bigger, you probably know they can mechanize more processes. They can have more of an assembly line type of product production, something like that. They can buy inputs in bulk and get better prices on them. So all those things are examples of economies of scale. The second little sub-bullet there, natural monopoly, is a special case of economies of scale. And that is where one firm can produce at a lower cost than two or more could. So that market is naturally going to become a monopoly because it's just more efficient for one firm to service the whole market. Emera is a perfect example of that. Emera, the electric utility around here, has this system of electric poles and utility lines strung out all over the central part of Maine and connected to every building, every business, every house. That's a huge, huge investment. It would make no sense at all for a second company to come in and set up a whole second system of poles and lines that connect to everybody's house just so we had two options. So that's an example of a natural monopoly. In reality, those industries are going to tend to be granted legal status as monopolies and then regulated by the government. So that's the case with Emera. A closely related barrier is sunk costs. Anytime you have a company that has very high startup costs that can't be recovered, those are sunk costs. So Emera, again, kind of fits that one. The cost of all those poles and lines is a huge sunk cost. Pharmaceutical companies would argue that they have very high sunk costs because they'll invest millions and millions of dollars. They'll probably go through dozens or more potential drugs that fail to make it to market before they find one. So they might have $1 billion invested before they find one drug that actually works. So something like that has very high startup costs. That tends to be a barrier. It's hard for somebody to come along and just start up a pharmaceutical company in your backyard. Next, restricted ownership of key inputs. That means that a business literally owns or have some way of restricting ownership of a certain input. These are kind of rare, but you may have heard of like the De Beers diamond monopoly. De Beers at one time owned something like 90% of all the land in the world that had diamonds in it. Or the OPEC oil cartel, same thing. They own most of the land that has oil. So, you can't just start a diamond company if you can't find land with diamonds under it. So that's an example of restricted ownership protecting De Beers' monopoly power. Government restrictions, I'll mention briefly. I mean, things like patents, copyrights, licenses are basically the government granting someone monopoly status. You're probably not likely to find antitrust cases about those because the government makes those barriers themselves. But understand that anytime you have a license to be a lobster fisherman or a patent on a product, or you have to be certified to be a hairdresser in Maine, that's the government giving you a certain amount of monopoly power because not just anyone can come in and compete with you. Last is just location. Sometimes location itself can be a barrier to entry. If you're the only gas station in a small town and you happen to be at the main crossroads, or if you're the only ski rental operation at the base of a ski lodge, lift, something like that, location itself can be a barrier. All right, so I'm going to stop it there and probably make a part 2 video shortly.